On Christmas Eve, my son pointed at the door and said, "Take Grandpa and leave. This night is for family." I pushed my 105-year-old father's wheelchair into the blizzard while my wife, son, and daughter-in-law watched from the warm mansion. The door slammed behind us. I thought our humiliation was over. Then headlights cut through the snow. A convoy of vintage luxury cars surrounded us. A silver-haired man stepped out, stared at my father, and quietly said the words that changed everything, "Sir. We've finally found you." Before we begin, drop a comment for me. What are you doing while you listen? Working, driving, maybe winding down for the evening, I read every comment, and your perspective matters more than you know. Quick note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling and reflection. What I hope stays with you is the message at the heart of this story. At 60 years old, wearing a 10-year-old brown suit, I had hemmed myself with kitchen twine. I buttoned my father into his matching flannel shirt and realized we were dressed like men who had nothing left to prove. The bedroom was small, the downstairs guest room we'd converted when stairs became impossible. Pale December light filtered through frost-edged windows. The room smelled of liniment and old wood, of dignity maintained when your body fails you. My father, Virgil Harrington, sat silent in his wooden wheelchair. 105 years old. Eyes clouded, jaw slack, hands motionless on the armrests. 15 years since the stroke. 15 years since he'd spoken a word or walked a step. I smoothed the collar of his flannel shirt, faded to the color of old pennies, matching the brown of my suit jacket, bought at an estate sale 15 years ago. The cuffs had been too long. I'd hemmed them with kitchen twine because I couldn't afford a tailor. The twine was still there, holding me together in ways I hadn't understood then. "Big night tonight, Dad," I said quietly. Garrett made the New York 30 under 30 list. Celeste ordered the whole menu a week ago. He didn't respond. He never did. But his thumb moved. Once. Slow. Deliberate. Pressing down against the carved wood of the wheelchair's left armrest with control that didn't come from muscle spasm. It was purposeful. Measured. Like Morse code tapped by someone who couldn't waste a gesture. I pretended not to notice. I'd learned over 15 years that some things were safer left unacknowledged. The house had already begun filling with noise. Celeste, my wife of 35 years, swept through the main hall in her camel coat, directing hired servers with authority she'd spent 3 decades perfecting. She had the voice of someone performing wealth so long she'd forgotten it was performance. "Not there." She snapped at a server arranging champagne flutes. "Crystal goes on the mahogany sideboard, not the oak credenza." She didn't look at me as I wheeled my father past. We were stage props in a production where neither of us had speaking roles. The dining hall blazed with light. Waterford crystal chandeliers. A 5-meter Christmas tree draped in Tiffany ornaments. 20 guests in black tie their champagne glasses, catching reflections across imported Italian marble. Garrett stood at the center. 32 years old, sharp-featured, dressed in a suit that cost more than I made in 6 months. My son, the hedge fund wunderkind. The reason for tonight's celebration. Vivian lingered near him. 28, my daughter, draped in diamonds borrowed from Celeste's collection. When she saw me wheeling my father through the crowd, she covered her mouth, but not quickly enough to hide the smirk. There was no place for us at the long mahogany table. Every seat filled, every setting arranged with precision. So I did what I always did, found the alcove near the restroom corridor, the only space wide enough for the wheelchair, and positioned my father beside the floor register that ticked every time the wheel brushed it. I fed him soup, slow, careful spoonfuls. Tomato bisque from a bowl set aside in the kitchen. Not the lobster bisque served to guests, but something simpler, appropriate for the man who'd built the fortune that paid for this house, but no longer warranted a seat at its table. 2 men in matching worn suits, one who'd raised me, one who'd been raised to believe dignity was something you purchased, not something you carried. The soup was still warm when Garrett approached. He held a wine-glass posture, casual smile, performative. But his voice was pitched just loud enough to carry. Loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. Loud enough to ensure what he said next would have an audience. He said the word landing like a stone. "Do us a favor and take Grandpa to the laundry room. The smell of illness is starting to affect my partner's $5,000 wine." I didn't move. The soup spoon hovered halfway to my father's mouth. Around us, polite laughter died. Coltrane jazz kept playing from hidden speakers. Crystal clinked against china. But the conversations, all 20 of them, had found something more interesting to pretend not to hear. The smell of illness. 4 words. Delivered with surgical precision in front of Boston society. 4 words designed to reduce 105 years of life to something offensive. Something that needed to be removed. Hidden. Erased. I looked down at the bowl, at my father's slack face, at the brown suit jacket I wore that matched his flannel shirt, both of us dressed in fabric that had seen better decades. I swallowed my pride. I swallowed my anger. I swallowed everything that wanted to remind my son that the man he'd just insulted had built the empire funding his arrogance. I said nothing. Garrett smiled. He'd gotten what he wanted: my silence, my compliance. My humiliation served warm in front of witnesses who would remember this moment long after the champagne wore off. He turned back to his guests, already laughing, already moving on. But I stayed frozen. Soup spoon suspended. The floor register ticking. My father's thumb resting motionless. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where 15 years of quiet observation had taught me to notice things others missed, I registered what I'd seen just before Garrett walked away. My father's thumb had moved again, twice this time. Deliberate, controlled, almost like he was counting. I didn't understand what my father was counting until the sound of porcelain shattering against metal was loud enough that the pianist in the corner missed a note. Celeste had begun serving the main course at 7:45. She moved down the length of the mahogany table with practiced grace, placing plates of prime rib and truffle risotto before each of the 20 guests. The Bordeaux she poured was a 2015 vintage that cost more than most people made in a month. Her smile was warm. Her hands were steady. She looked like a woman hosting a perfect Christmas Eve. She bypassed my father entirely. I waited. Watched her circle the table twice, once with meat, once with wine, and both times she walked past the alcove where we sat as if the wheelchair were simply another piece of furniture that didn't require acknowledgement. When she finished, I stood. "Celeste," I said, my voice steady. "A plate for my father, please." She turned, looked at me, not at him, never at him. Then she crossed the room in 3 sharp strides, snatched the soup bowl from where it rested on the side table beside my father's wheelchair, and hurled it into the metal trash can by the sideboard. The crash silenced the room. The pianist's hands froze above the keys. 20 conversations died mid-sentence. Even the kitchen staff visible through the service door stopped moving. Celeste gestured toward the kitchen without looking at my father. "There are leftovers from lunch in the kitchen," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Cold ham. He can have that." Beside Garrett, Vivian covered her mouth, not to hide shock, to hide a smile. I looked down at my father. His eyes were still clouded, his expression slack. But his hands were no longer resting passively on the armrests. His fingers had curled slightly, gripping the worn wood with just enough pressure that I could see the tendons standing out beneath his papery skin. He was aware, he was present, and he was enduring this with the kind of silence that came from decades of choosing battles carefully. I didn't retrieve the ham. The pianist resumed playing. Conversations restarted quieter, now edged with the particular tone people use when pretending they haven't witnessed something shameful. The prime rib steamed on 20 plates. The Bordeaux caught the light from the chandeliers, and in the shadowed alcove by the restroom corridor, my father and I sat in matching worn suits, watching a celebration that had no place for men like us. How does a son look at his own father with that much cold in his eyes and still call himself human? At 8:15, Garrett stood at the head of the table. He held the carving knife sterling silver monogrammed part of a set that had belonged to my father's grandmother. He looked down the length of the room past the guests and the crystal and the perfect Christmas tree directly at my father, sitting in that wheelchair 40 feet away. "You don't get a seat at this table," he said. His voice was flat, cold, the kind of cold that came from decision, not emotion. The room went still again, and then my father spoke. His voice was soft, so soft I almost missed it. But the nearest guests heard. I heard, and Garrett heard. He sat at plenty of mine. Garrett's face drained white, not pale, white. The color of someone who'd just seen a ghost they thought they'd buried years ago. His hand tightened on the carving knife handle. For 3 seconds, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stood there frozen, staring at a 105-year-old man in a wheelchair who shouldn't have been able to speak at all. Then he set the knife down with terrifying precision. I stood. "See, he is your grandfather," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "And you are feeding him scraps in the corner like—" The slap caught me across the left cheek before I finished the sentence. Celeste's hand. My wife of 35 years. The sound echoed off the imported marble like a gunshot. My head snapped sideways. The taste of copper filled my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. Nobody moved. 20 guests. A pianist. Kitchen staff visible through the service door. Not one of them said a word. Garrett reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded document. He unfolded it with the care of someone handling evidence, laid it on the table in front of me. A quitclaim deed. Legal language I could barely parse through the ringing in my ears. Transfer of property interest. Harrington Estate, Wellesley, Massachusetts. Signed in what looked like my handwriting. Dated December 23rd, 2024. Yesterday. "You signed it last night," Garrett said quietly. "After the wine. You don't remember, do you? That's unfortunate. But it's legal. Witnessed. Notarized. The house is ours now. You're trespassing. Yesterday. The wine that had tasted slightly bitter. The way I'd woken this morning with a headache I'd attributed to stress. They drugged me. Positioned my hand. Made me sign away the only home my father had left. Celeste walked to the front door. Threw it open. December wind howled into the dining hall carrying snow and cold that dropped the temperature 10 degrees in seconds. Outside, the blizzard had intensified. Snow fell in sheets accumulating in drifts against the stone porch. "We're done carrying dead weight," Celeste said, her voice cutting through the wind. "Both of you, out." I looked at my father. At the man who'd built the fortune that had paid for this house, who'd raised children who now treated him like refuse to be discarded. His eyes met mine, still clouded, still seemingly distant, but his thumb pressed the armrest 3 times, deliberate, controlled, counting something I didn't yet understand. I gripped the wheelchair handles, turned toward the door. Pushed my father past 20 silent witnesses, past my son, who wouldn't meet my eyes, past my wife who'd just struck me in front of Boston society, and out into the freezing darkness of Christmas Eve. The door closed behind us. The deadbolt turned with the mechanical click of a lock that had been oiled for exactly this moment. And the only sound left on that frozen porch was the bad wheel of my father's chair ticking against the wood, like a clock that didn't know the hour had already passed. Temperature -9 degrees Celsius. Distance to the iron gates, 40 feet through ankle-deep snow. I had no coat. My father wore only his flannel shirt. And the house that had locked us out blazed with light and warmth and the sound of a party that had already moved on to dessert. The front wheel caught on a ridge of frozen snow 3 feet from the iron gates, and the wheelchair tilted sideways, slow, unstoppable, the physics of a 105-year-old man and 40 pounds of oak deciding which direction gravity preferred. I lunged, caught the armrest with both hands before the chair could pitch completely into the snowbank. My knees hit the ice beneath the snow. Pain shot through both kneecaps, but I held on, bracing my weight against the frame, levering it back to vertical within 10 seconds. My father didn't make a sound, didn't cry out. His hands gripped the armrests with what little strength he had left, knuckles white fingers already turning that shade of red that comes before frostbite claims its territory. I stripped off my suit jacket, the only layer I had between me and the December wind, and draped it over his knees. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. We'd struggled through 40 feet of ankle-deep snow to reach these gates, and now we stood on the other side of them, with no coat between us and -9 degrees Celsius. I knelt in the snow, gripped his hands in mine. They were ice, rigid. The kind of cold that doesn't come back quickly even when you bring it inside. I said, my voice breaking on the word. I'm sorry. I lost your home. I couldn't protect you. He looked at me, through me. Those clouded eyes that hadn't seemed to focus on anything for 15 years suddenly locked onto mine with clarity that stole my breath. A single tear fell from his left eye. I watched it track down his wrinkled cheek, catching the distant glow from the house where we were no longer welcome. It froze before it could drop into the snow. Just stopped. Crystallized. A permanent monument to the moment I'd failed the man who'd raised me, that tear frozen on his cheek. I have carried the image of it every day since. Some things you don't forget because you can't, because they mark the exact moment your life divided into before and after. I was still holding his hands when the darkness changed. Not slowly, all at once. Headlights. Multiple. Bright enough to throw shadows across the snow that hadn't been there seconds before. I turned. 6 vehicles rolled through the iron gates in perfect formation. Not SUVs, not modern luxury sedans. These were something else entirely. Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts. Bentley State Limousines. Vintage Massachusetts plates. Black paint so deep it looked like liquid even under streetlights. Chrome that caught the snow like mirrors. These weren't cars people bought. These were vehicles that sat in climate-controlled carriage houses of families who'd been wealthy since before the World Wars. The kind of automobiles passed down through generations because new money couldn't buy them at any price. They parked in a line exactly 3 meters apart. Headlights shut off in unison, leaving only the yellow glow of the estate behind us and the white of falling snow. Doors opened. Security personnel stepped out, 6 of them, dressed in black wool overcoats, each carrying a large umbrella. They moved with military precision, positioning themselves beside the vehicles without speaking. From the lead Rolls-Royce, a man emerged, Thaddeus Prescott. 65 years old, silver-haired, immaculate in a black Crombie overcoat and Homburg hat. Beneath it, I could see bespoke Savile Row tailoring the kind that required 3 fittings and cost more than most cars. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine despite the snow. His footsteps were steady, measured like a man walking into a courtroom where he already knew the verdict. He approached my father's wheelchair, dropped to one knee in the snow, bowed his head. He looked at my father for a long moment. Then, barely above a whisper, "Sir," he said, "we've finally found you." Then he straightened. Brice. Mr. Virgil Harrington. He said, his voice carrying across the frozen driveway with perfect clarity. The 15-year covenant concludes tonight. The one who remained is Desmond. By your prior instruction, I am activating the Harrington Trust. I stopped breathing. The words made no sense. Covenant. Trust. Activating. My father hadn't spoken coherently in 15 years, hadn't made a legal decision since the stroke. And yet this man, this attorney in his perfectly tailored suit, was kneeling in the snow before him like he was addressing royalty. And 6 of them had just rolled onto the property to answer my father's call. Behind me, I heard the sound of a balcony door sliding open. I turned. Celeste stood on the second-floor balcony in her evening gown, Garrett beside her in his tailored suit. Vivian draped in her borrowed diamonds. All 3 of them stared down at the fleet of vehicles idling in the driveway, their faces pale, their expressions frozen in something that looked like the early stages of understanding. The kind of understanding that comes when you realize you've been playing checkers while someone else was playing chess. And you just lost your king without ever seeing it leave the board. Who are these people? Garrett asked, his voice thin and uncertain for the first time all evening. Nobody answered him. That I would later understand was itself a kind of answer. The kind you give when you realize the man you just threw into the snow holds every card you thought you were playing. Prescott remained kneeling. My father's hand moved just slightly, his thumb pressing against the wheelchair armrest. 4 times. Deliberate, controlled, like he'd been counting all along. The attorney reached into his coat and withdrew a gold-embossed leather portfolio. The kind of document case that holds things written on paper worth more than most people's houses. He stood, brushed snow from his knee with practiced efficiency, met my eyes for the first time. Mr. Desmond Harrington, he said quietly. Your father has been waiting 15 years to have this conversation with you. I apologize that it begins in the cold, but I suspect you'll find the next few minutes worth the inconvenience. He opened the portfolio, and everything I understood about the man shivering in the wheelchair beside me shattered like ice hitting pavement from a great height. The sound of the portfolio opening cut through the wind like a blade through silk, genuine alligator leather, the kind that costs what most men earn in a year unzipped, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this exact thing in 100 courtrooms and never once doubted the outcome. Prescott stood in the snow beneath the yellow light spilling from the house windows. 6 vehicles idled behind him in perfect formation. Security personnel held umbrellas against the falling snow, and my father sat beside me in his wheelchair, silent as he'd been for 15 years, watching with eyes that seemed clearer than they'd been in decades. Prescott began to read. The man you pushed through that door tonight, he said, his voice carrying over the December wind with perfect clarity, is not Virgil Harrington, a retired laborer of no consequence. He paused. Let the words settle. His full legal name is Virgil Raymond Harrington, founder and sole owner of Harrington Oil and Gas, a privately held oil and gas enterprise currently valued at $11 billion. The number landed like a physical blow. From the balcony, I heard Celeste make a sound, sharp, choked, like someone had struck her in the stomach. Garrett grabbed the railing. Vivian took a step backward, her borrowed diamonds catching the light. $11 billion. The number didn't fit in my head. It didn't fit in the snow, in the wheelchair, in the 10-year-old suit I was wearing. It didn't fit anywhere in the world I had understood up until that exact second. I looked at my father. He sat motionless, silent. But his eyes, those clouded eyes that hadn't seemed to focus on anything for 15 years, were locked on Prescott with absolute clarity. Prescott continued reading. 15 years ago, Mr. Harrington observed that greed had corrupted his direct bloodline. He established a legally binding covenant, a test, if you will. Whoever remained by his side without condition, without knowledge of his wealth, without expectation of inheritance, would receive everything. He looked up from the document, met my eyes. That person is Desmond, he said quietly. His adopted son, the only one who never asked what was in it for him. I stopped breathing. 15 years. 5,475 days of changing dressings and heating soup and telling stories to a man I believed couldn't hear me. Pushing his wheelchair through snow to family gatherings where we were treated like furniture. Sitting in alcoves by restroom corridors while everyone else ate prime rib, and he had heard every word, every single word. While writing my name into a will I never knew existed, I thought about all those years. 15 winters of driving to Wellesley every night after work, reading financial journals aloud to a man whose eyes never focused, whose hand never squeezed back, whose mouth never formed words. I'd done it because he was my father, because he'd raised me, because when you love someone you don't ask what's in it for you, and apparently that was the answer he'd been looking for all along. You're lying. Garrett's voice cracked across the frozen air, high and desperate. He's been a vegetable for 15 years. He can't even... Your grandfather, Prescott, interrupted his tone sharp enough to cut glass, suffered a stroke in 2009 that resulted in significant motor and speech impairment. He has been receiving care at this residence under the supervision of medical professionals who report to me. His cognitive function has never been in question. On the balcony, Celeste swayed, grabbed Garrett's arm for support. Garrett ripped something from his vest pocket. The quitclaim deed. The one I'd supposedly signed while drugged. He held it up like a weapon, like evidence, like salvation. It doesn't matter, he screamed, his voice breaking. I have the signed deed. This house belongs to me. Legal transfer of property, witnessed and notarized. You can't, read about that, Prescott said. His voice dropped 20 degrees. He looked at the paper Garrett was waving the way a surgeon looks at a tumor he's about to remove. Calm, clinical, already knowing the outcome. He opened the second section of the folder. The snow fell harder. The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Behind me, one of the security personnel adjusted his umbrella, angling it to keep the documents dry. The vehicles idled in perfect formation, their engines a low rumble beneath the wind. I knelt in the snow beside my father's wheelchair, my hands still numb from the cold, my cheek still burning from where my wife had struck me, my world still reeling from revelations I couldn't process. $11 billion. A 15-year test I'd passed without knowing I was being tested. An inheritance I'd never asked for, built on nothing more than showing up every night to care for a man who couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge my presence. The property you're standing on, Prescott said, his voice cutting through my thoughts like a knife through fog, has been the subject of considerable legal activity over the past 16 months. Activity that your enthusiasm with that quitclaim deed has just brought to its natural conclusion. Garrett's face had gone white. Whiter than the snow. Whiter than anything I'd ever seen on a living person. What are you talking about? He whispered. Prescott smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who'd spent 15 years preparing for this exact moment and was about to enjoy every second of what came next. The Harrington estate, he said, slowly savoring each word, carries a mortgage of $7.3 million. That mortgage was acquired by Harrington Holdings, LLC, a subsidiary of your grandfather's oil and gas enterprise 16 months ago. The terms include a standard due-on-transfer acceleration clause. He paused. Let the words sink in. The moment you had Desmond sign that quitclaim deed, you triggered that clause. The moment you physically evicted the mortgagor from the property, you accelerated the entire debt. And the moment you locked that door, he checked his watch. 17 minutes ago, to be precise, you transferred legal ownership to the mortgage holder. Another pause. Longer this time. Well, which is Desmond? The second page was typed on law firm letterhead, dated 16 months earlier, August 2023. and the first 3 words were enough to stop Garrett's breathing mortgage note acquisition. Prescott read without inflection, his voice carrying across the frozen driveway, like a judge delivering a verdict that had already been written. 16 months ago, he said, Harrington Holdings, LLC, a subsidiary company owned entirely by the Harrington Trust, acquired the senior mortgage note on this specific property from First Boston Bank. The note was in default by 43 days at the time of purchase. Garrett stared at the paper in his hands. The quitclaim deed. The one he'd waved like a trophy 30 seconds ago. It was shaking now, Prescott continued. When you signed that deed tonight and executed the transfer to yourself, you triggered the standard due-on-transfer acceleration clause within the mortgage contract. Harrington Holdings, LLC exercised its legal right under Massachusetts law to accelerate the full loan balance immediately. He turned a page. The sound of paper against paper was unnaturally loud in the silence. The foreclosure notice was filed with the registry this afternoon, after all statutory waiting windows were honored over 16 months. The documentation is complete. The chain of title is clean. Another pause. The GPS unit embedded in Mr. Virgil Harrington's wheelchair confirmed his physical removal from the primary residence at exactly 8:07 p.m. tonight. I looked down at my father's wheelchair, at the armrest I'd gripped 1,000 times. Somewhere in that wood and metal was a tracking device that had been counting down to this moment for over a year. Prescott met Garrett's eyes. The foreclosure filing was submitted to the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds this afternoon. The paperwork is complete. The chain of title is clean, and the statutory waiting periods under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 244, have been fully satisfied over the past 16 months. The registry will formally record the transfer within 55 hours. But make no mistake, the legal right to this property is already Desmond's. Tonight simply confirmed the trigger. Garrett's knees buckled. He didn't fall, but he swayed, grabbing the balcony railing for support. The deed slipped from his fingers, falling into the snow, where it landed face up, my forged signature still visible in the yellow light from the house. A GPS unit on a wheelchair. 16 months of legal groundwork. A deed that triggered its own destruction the moment it was signed. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is what you do when you're angry. This was architecture. I turned to look at my father. He sat in his wheelchair, hands still resting on the armrests, expression still seemingly vacant. But his thumb moved. 5 times. Deliberate. Controlled. Like he was counting something I couldn't yet understand. Garrett's phone rang. He ignored it. Let it go to voicemail. But it rang again immediately. And again. The sound cutting through the wind like an alarm that wouldn't stop. He pulled it from his pocket with shaking hands. Looked at the screen. Whatever he saw there drained something from him that didn't come back. His face went from white to gray. His hand dropped to his side. The phone kept ringing, but he wasn't answering anymore. Just staring at the notifications cascading down the screen like dominoes falling in slow motion. Prescott didn't need to see the phone to know what it said. The corporate entity that provided 90% of your fund's capital for the past 5 years, he said quietly, was Harrington Holdings, LLC, operating through 3 nested shell company names you never traced. Garrett's mouth opened. No sound came out. We funded you, Prescott continued. We monitored you. And tonight at 8:09 p.m. we sent a single liquidation instruction to our prime broker. The phone was still ringing. Notifications were still arriving. I could see them from where I knelt in the snow alerts from Bloomberg, from the Wall Street Journal, from investors whose names I recognized from the party that had been happening inside the house 20 minutes ago. Every major institutional anchor investor pulled their capital simultaneously within a 90-second liquidation window, Prescott said. The fund is finished, fully unwound, and the SEC has officially opened an enforcement investigation into you for violating the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, accepting capital from an affiliated entity with an undisclosed material conflict of interest. Garrett dropped to his knees, not carefully, not slowly. He just fell, his expensive suit sinking into the snow, his phone still clutched in one hand, his face buried in the other. 5 years. 5 years of hedge fund success. 5 years of magazine covers and 30 under 30 lists and dinner parties where he'd explained his genius to people who believed him. And all of it, every dollar, every deal, every victory, had been funded by the man he'd just thrown into the snow. I've stood through worse things than cold. But watching a 28-year-old woman's face go from panic to calculation in the space of 3 seconds, that was the moment I understood we weren't done yet. Not even close. Vivian stood on the balcony beside Celeste, but she wasn't looking at her mother. Wasn't looking at Garrett kneeling in the snow. She was looking at me, then at Prescott. And her expression wasn't fear. It was assessment, calculation, like someone running numbers in her head and deciding whether the math worked in her favor. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket. Her fingers weren't shaking. That was the detail I couldn't explain, yet why the one person who should have been terrified looked like someone checking off items on a list. Celeste was gripping the balcony railing, her face pale, her diamonds catching the light from the vehicles below. But Vivian stood perfectly still, perfectly calm, her hand in her pocket, and her eyes moving between Prescott and me like she was measuring distance or calculating leverage. Prescott closed the folder. The sound was final, definitive, like a judge's gavel ending a trial. There is more, he said quietly, looking at me now instead of Garrett. But perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere warmer. Your father has been in the cold long enough. One of the security personnel stepped forward, opening the rear door of the lead Rolls-Royce. Warm air spilled out into the December night, carrying the smell of leather and wood polish, and money so old it didn't need to announce itself. I stood, gripped the wheelchair handles, started to push my father toward the vehicle, and as I passed beneath the balcony, I heard Vivian's voice, soft and controlled, speaking to someone I couldn't see. I need to make a call, she said. Not asking permission, stating fact. Her hand was still in her pocket. Her fingers still weren't shaking. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from watching people your whole life, that whatever she was planning had been in motion long before tonight. I didn't follow Vivian's gaze as she announced she needed to make a call. I was looking at someone else. I looked at the woman I had shared a bed with for 35 years, the woman whose coffee order I knew by heart, whose sister's birthday I remembered when she forgot whose hand I'd held through 2 miscarriages and a father's funeral, and I asked the question that would cost me more than the wealth I'd just inherited. Celeste. I said, my voice raspy from the cold, but steady. Why 35 years? I gave you everything I had. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Garrett, then at Prescott, then back at me. Prescott cut in before she could answer. Mr. Harrington, he said quietly, opening the 3rd section of his file. Allow me to answer that. He pulled out a document. Even from 10 feet away, I could see it was old, the paper yellowed with age, the typing done on a manual machine that had left impressions deep enough to feel from the other side. 35 years ago. Prescott read, Celeste discovered a partial probate document from the legacy estate, just enough to understand that you were Virgil's most beloved adopted son and presumptive heir. The words landed like stones in still water. She initiated the relationship deliberately, he continued. She married you to wait. I stopped breathing. Prescott kept reading. Your father documented her research, the courthouse visits, the public records requests, the questions she asked mutual acquaintances about your background, your adoption, your relationship with Virgil. She built a file on you before the first date. He looked up, met my eyes. She has not loved you a single day, Desmond. I am sorry to say it so plainly. But your father insisted you hear it from a certified document, not from her mouth, because a document cannot lie to spare your feelings. I have stood through worse things than cold. But that sentence, a document cannot lie to spare your feelings, did something to the ground under my feet that the ice had not managed. 35 years, not one day. I thought about the morning coffee I'd brought her in bed for 3 decades, the anniversary cards I'd written by hand, the time I'd sold my car to pay for her mother's medical bills because she'd asked, and I'd never asked why she couldn't use her own accounts. Every moment, every gesture, every word of love I'd spoken into the silence of our bedroom when she was asleep and couldn't hear me. None of it had ever been real. That's not... Celeste started, her voice high and sharp. He can't prove... The document is notarized, Prescott said. Witnessed. Filed with this firm in 1989. Every detail of your research into Desmond's background is cataloged, including the date you discovered he was adopted, March 14th, 1989. 3 weeks before your first conversation with him. Celeste's mouth closed. Her face had gone pale. Prescott wasn't finished. He turned his gaze, moving from Celeste to Vivienne, who still stood on the balcony with her hand in her coat pocket, her expression unreadable. And now, Prescott said, his voice dropping to something colder, we address the matter of active harm. He pulled another file from the portfolio. This one was thicker. Medical records, laboratory reports, documents with official seals I could see even from the snow. For 5 years, he read, his voice carrying across the frozen driveway, like a prosecutor addressing a jury. You 2 women introduced low-dose heavy metal compounds and immunosuppressants into Mr. Virgil Harrington's evening medication and herbal tea. The words hung in the air. Compounds engineered to suppress immune response and mimic accelerated neurological deterioration. Celeste grabbed the balcony railing. You have no proof of that, she screamed, her voice cracking. Prescott looked at her the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. Virgil's private physician, he said calmly, was retained and compensated exclusively by this law firm for 4 years. He regularly collected monthly blood and hair samples under the guise of charitable wellness checkups. He turned a page. Every sample, every foreign compound identified, every specific date of administration, fully cataloged. Another page. The files have been in the possession of the FBI's Elder Justice Unit since October 2024. Years of documented evidence built and maintained by your father. You need to understand what that means. 5 years. 60 months. Every single night my father sat in that wheelchair drinking poisoned tea while the women who called themselves family calculated how long it would take for the compounds to finish what the stroke had started. And he knew. The entire time he knew. I looked at my father. At the man sitting silently in his wheelchair, hands resting on the armrests, eyes seemingly vacant. But I saw it now. The clarity behind the clouds. The awareness that had always been there, hidden beneath a performance more convincing than any I'd ever witnessed. He'd let them poison him. For years, just to see who I was when I stayed beside him anyway. Prescott continued. State charges under Massachusetts elder abuse laws are being prepared. Federal wire fraud charges as well, given that communications planning the coordination occurred across state lines. He closed the file. Both of you will be arrested. The timeline is not negotiable. The evidence is comprehensive. And the witnesses, including medical professionals, laboratory technicians, and digital forensic specialists, are already under subpoena. Celeste swayed, grabbed Vivian's arm for support. But Vivian didn't move to help her. Her hand was still in her coat pocket. And when Prescott named her as an active co-conspirator in the poisoning plot, she didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't cry. She just stood there perfectly still, perfectly calm, like someone who'd known this moment was coming and had been preparing for it in a way nobody in this driveway had anticipated. That was when I understood. Vivian hadn't been surprised by anything Prescott had said tonight. Not the trust, not the money, not the poisoning charges. She'd known, and whatever she'd been planning, whatever that call was about whatever her hand was touching in that coat pocket, it was about to change the equation one more time. Before I could process what Vivian's prepared composure meant, another sound cut through the frozen air. The sound of a grown man crawling through snow on his knees, calling me Dad in a voice that cracked like ice under weight. That was the sound that would echo in my skull for months afterward, long after I understood that the word had never meant what I thought it meant. Garrett came forward through the snow, his expensive suit soaking through his hands, clawing at the ice for purchase. He grabbed my legs, his fingers digging into my calves with desperate strength. "Dad!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "I'm your son. You can't let them do this to me." I looked down at him, at the man I'd raised, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I'd helped with college applications, the adult I'd watched accept awards I'd been too proud to attend because I didn't want to embarrass him by showing up in my old suit. Prescott reached into his briefcase, pulled out a single page, placed it face up on the leather lid where the yellow light from the house caught it clearly. "This is a certified DNA paternity analysis," he said, his voice clinical, "conducted by an AABB-accredited laboratory fully admissible in a Massachusetts civil court." He paused. "Garrett is not the biological offspring of Desmond. He is the product of an extramarital affair between Celeste and a regional commercial banking officer approximately 32 years ago." The words landed like physical blows. Garrett's hands loosened on my legs, not immediately, slowly, like someone losing strength as blood drains from a wound. I looked down at the document, at the official seal, at the two names listed under the paternity probability calculation 0%. 32 years. Thousands of times I heard that word. Dad. Little league games and high school graduations and the day he got accepted to business school. Every single time the word was a lie. Not because of the DNA, because he knew. At 25, he learned the truth, and he kept calling me Dad for 7 more years, while planning how to take everything. I looked down at Garrett, not with hatred, but with the look of a man staring at a familiar face and realizing for the first time he had absolutely no idea who he was looking at. No anger, just the cold clinical reality of a name printed on official stationery. "Get off me," I said quietly. Garrett's hands tightened again. "Please, get off me." He released his grip, fell backward into the snow, stared up at me like I was the one who'd betrayed him. Then Vivian moved. She shoved past Garrett, nearly stepping on him in her rush down from the balcony. Her heels clicked against the frozen stone steps as she ran toward where I stood beside my father's wheelchair. She dropped to her knees at my feet. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice pitched high and urgent. "I was coerced. I have the recordings. Celeste and Garrett planned everything. Every dollar, every dose. I can hand it all over to the authorities right now." She pulled something from her coat pocket, a small digital recorder, held it up like evidence, like salvation. 6 months of conversations," she said. "Everything they said. Everything they planned. I documented all of it." Garrett lunged at her from the snow. Prescott stepped between them. His hand raised, his voice remaining professionally calm despite the chaos. "Miss Vivian contacted our firm 6 months ago," he said, looking at me instead of her. Not out of a sudden burst of conscience, but seeking to sell internal data for personal immunity. Vivian's face went pale. We declined any financial transaction, Prescott continued. Instead, we took a different approach entirely. Prior to each relevant meeting Vivian attended with Celeste and Garrett, she signed and delivered written consent notification forms to both parties framed as standard legal documentation required by our firm for any meeting involving estate planning discussions. Celeste and Garrett signed them without reading carefully. Under Massachusetts law, those signatures constituted the all-party consent required for lawful recording. He pulled out another document. We had her sign documented consent forms prior to each relevant meeting she had with Celeste and Garrett. Every single audio file she compiled is fully admissible. She wasn't wiretapping. She was a party to the conversation. Vivian's expression shifted. Relief flooded her features. "So I am legally protected?" she asked. Prescott looked down at her. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went colder. "No." The word hung in the frozen air. "The covenant is absolute," he said. "Any individual with direct knowledge of the elder abuse who actively participated in the public humiliation of the designated heir is subject to its forfeiture clauses." He closed the document. "Miss Vivian, you are going to federal detention alongside your husband." She thought she was playing chess, building leverage, recording evidence, positioning herself as the useful witness. What she didn't understand was that my father didn't play chess. He built legal architecture. And architecture doesn't care how clever you think you are. It just stands there and holds the weight. Vivian's face didn't crumple, didn't cry. She just looked at me with something I hadn't expected. Not fear, just the flat recognition of someone who played every card she had and still lost. There was almost something honest about it. "But I tried," she said quietly. "Not to Prescott. To me. I saw what they were doing, and I tried to find a way out that didn't destroy me too." "You participated," I said. She nodded, once. Sharp, final. "I did. No excuses, no pleading, just acknowledgement." Prescott opened the next section of the folder. The motion was mechanical, practiced, like a judge moving to the next case on a docket that had been scheduled months in advance. "There is one more detail," he said, "that requires clarification before we proceed to transportation." He pulled out a stack of printed emails. The pages were thick, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The FBI recovered encrypted email exchanges between Garrett and Celeste from his corporate employer's server under federal warrant. The metadata proves that at age 25, Garrett learned from Celeste he wasn't your biological son. Prescott looked at Garrett, who had gone completely still in the snow. "He deliberately chose to remain silent and continued accepting your financial support for 7 additional years, while actively collaborating with his mother to accelerate the asset drainage plan." I looked at Garrett, at the man who'd known for 7 years. 7 years of calling me dad while plotting how to take everything I'd given him. He met my eyes, and for the first time all night, he didn't look away. That was when the fury finally came. Not hot, cold. Absolutely cold. 7 years of mornings. Birthdays and business school graduations and the day he closed his first deal. Every time that word, Dad. And every time he knew it was a performance. The DNA didn't break me, the 7 years did. That's what finally cracked something open inside me that the cold and the slap and the soup bowl in the trash had not managed. I looked at Garrett. He was still on his knees in the snow, still staring up at me. But something in his expression had changed. The desperation was gone. What remained was something uglier. Something that looked almost like relief that he didn't have to pretend anymore. "You were never going to give me anything," he said, his voice flat. "You were just the middleman, waiting for the old man to die so you could I would have given you everything, I said quietly. The word stopped him. So if you'd asked, I continued. If you'd needed help, if you'd come to me and said the fund was failing, or the investors were pulling out, or you were in over your head, I would have emptied every account I had, sold everything I owned, because that's what fathers do. I looked down at him. But you didn't want a father. You wanted an inheritance. And those are not the same thing. Garrett's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. I turned to Prescott, so in my father's trust. I said, my voice steady despite the ice forming on my breath. Is there truly a provision for those who merely watched and did nothing? Prescott pulled out the final page of the trust agreement. The paper was thick, official, embossed with a seal I could see even from 10 feet away. Your father was exceptionally precise on this legal point, he said. I quote, any individual with direct or constructive knowledge of the elder abuse or asset fraud who failed to take affirmative steps to prevent it and who actively participated in the public or private degradation of the designated heir shall forfeit all equitable claims against this estate and face maximum statutory exposure. He looked up. Miss Vivian possessed direct knowledge of the ongoing poisoning. She attended the dinner tonight. She participated in the exclusion. She is fully covered. Vivian didn't argue, didn't plead. She just stood there in the snow, her hand still in her coat pocket, her face expressionless. Prescott raised his hand. 3 of the security personnel stepped forward. Professional, efficient. They produced handcuffs, not the plastic zip ties you see in movies, but actual steel restraints that clicked with mechanical precision. Celeste screamed when they touched her arm. The sound was high, desperate. Nothing like the controlled voice that had directed servers and slapped me across the face an hour ago. You can't do this, she shrieked. I have rights, I have... You have the right to remain silent, one of the security personnel said quietly. I suggest you exercise it. Garrett didn't resist when they cuffed him. He just let them pull his arms behind his back, his expression vacant like someone who'd already left his body and was watching from somewhere else. Vivian held out her wrists before they even asked. 3 vehicles. 3 people who thought they were hunting an inheritance. What they never understood was that they weren't hunters. They were mice. And the trap had been built 15 years before they ever stepped into it. My father didn't set traps to hurt people. He set them to hold exactly the weight they deserved. They were escorted to separate vehicles, black sedans that had pulled up behind the Rolls-Royce fleet while Prescott was reading. I hadn't even noticed them arrive. Celeste was still screaming when her door closed. The sound cut off abruptly. Soundproofing, probably. The kind of detail you don't think about until you need it. Garrett climbed into his vehicle without looking back. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't ask for forgiveness. Just got in and sat down like he was getting into a taxi. Vivian paused before her door closed. Looked at me one more time. I'm sorry, she said. Not for what she'd done. Just sorry, like she was apologizing for bad weather or traffic. The door closed. 3 sets of taillights moved down the driveway, turned left onto the main road, disappeared into the storm that had picked up while we'd been standing in the cold. The house behind me was still lit, every window blazing, the Christmas tree visible through the front windows, its Tiffany ornaments catching the light. The jazz was still playing. I could hear it faintly through the closed doors. Coltrane. The same album that had been background music to my humiliation an hour ago. The party was over. The guests had left through a side exit while the arrests were happening. I'd seen them slip away in 2s and 3s, their faces carefully neutral, already composing the stories they'd tell at their own dinner parties about the night they witnessed the Harrington family implode. Prescott stood beside me in the snow. There is one more thing, he said quietly. He walked to the lead Rolls-Royce. opened the rear door, reached inside, pulled out a wooden box, small, polished, cedar from the smell of it. He handed it to me. Your father wrote you letters. 217 of them, one for every night he chose silence over words. The 218th he wrote this morning. You will find it at the bottom. He instructed me to give them to you tonight in order. The smell of cedar hit me first, old wood, and something else I couldn't name, until Prescott opened the lid and I saw the stack of envelopes inside, each one addressed in blue fountain pen ink, to a name I had carried for 60 years but had never truly understood until that exact second, beloved son. We were inside the lead Rolls-Royce. The door had closed behind us, sealing out the wind and the snow and the sounds of the estate fading into the storm. Warm air wrapped around us like a blanket. The leather seats smelled of polish and age and money that didn't need to announce itself. My father sat beside me in his wheelchair, which one of the security personnel had lifted into the vehicle with mechanical efficiency. He was silent, still. But his eyes were clear in a way I hadn't seen in 15 years. Prescott placed the cedar box on the leather seat between us. For 15 years, he said quietly, every single night after the household retired, your father sat up and wrote you a letter by hand. I stared at the box. He never mailed them, Prescott continued. He instructed me to deliver them to you tonight in this exact chronological order. He lifted the lid fully. The stack inside was thick. Cream-colored envelopes, each one sealed with red wax, bearing an impression I couldn't make out in the dim interior light. There are 217 letters, Prescott said. One for every night. I reached for the top envelope. My hands were shaking, not from the cold anymore, from something else. The wax seal broke easily under my thumb. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper, folded once. The handwriting was my father's. I recognized it immediately from the signatures on birthday cards. He'd stopped being able to write after the stroke. I unfolded the page. The date at the top was 15 years ago. December 26th. The day after Christmas. The day after he'd had the stroke that took his speech and his mobility and everything I'd thought made him my father. I read, Dear Desmond, today you changed the sterile dressing on my left heel for the 3rd time this week. It took you 40 minutes, and you didn't make a single sound of complaint. I wanted to tell you that I noticed. I have always noticed. Every single thing. The letter continued, but I couldn't read any further. I folded the paper, put it back in the envelope, set it gently on top of the stack in the cedar box. Then I looked out the frosted window into the raging storm and wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. I cried the way a man cries when something inside him breaks that he didn't know could break. Great shaking sobs that made my chest hurt, that fogged the glass that carried 15 years of grief I hadn't known I was carrying. 40 minutes changing a dressing. A detail so small I had forgotten it by the time I walked back upstairs. But he remembered. He wrote it down in blue ink on cream paper and kept it in a cedar box for 15 years so that on this exact night, in this exact car, I would finally understand that I had never once been invisible. Not for a single second. Prescott didn't speak, didn't offer comfort. He just sat there in the facing seat, his hands folded in his lap, his expression neutral, giving me the space to fall apart without witness or judgment. It took me 5 minutes to stop crying. Maybe longer. Time felt broken in that warm leather interior while the storm raged outside, and my father sat silently beside me watching with eyes that had always seen more than I'd understood. When I could breathe again, I looked at the box. 217 letters. I counted them later alone in a room I hadn't been inside yet. 217 nights he watched me and said nothing. 217 nights I thought I was caring for a man who couldn't understand. The silence wasn't cruelty. It was patience. The kind a man has when he's building something too large to explain with words. Prescott waited until my breathing steadied. Then he pulled another document from his briefcase. This one was older. The paper yellowed with age. The typing done on a manual machine that had left deep impressions in the fiber. This is a certified copy of the original 1971 Incorporation Charter, he said, placing it in my hands. I looked down at the page, at the signatures at the bottom. 2 of them, Virgil Harrington, and below it D. Caldwell. I looked up. "Who is D. Caldwell?" I asked. Prescott paused. It was a deliberate pause, calculated, like he was choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. "That is a question your father explicitly wanted you to discover within the trust assets yourself," he said slowly. "Specifically in Section 4. He met my eyes. Well, he said some truths must be read in sequence, not explained out of turn. When you are ready." I looked down at the charter, at the name, D. Caldwell. 53 years old. A partner who'd been there at the beginning, who'd helped build whatever my father had built before I was even born. "Section 4, I repeated. Prescott nodded. "When you're ready," he said again. I slipped the charter into my breast pocket, right against my chest. The paper was warm from Prescott's briefcase. It settled there like it belonged. I didn't know then what that name meant. I put it away and told myself it could wait. It couldn't, as it turned out. But I didn't know that yet. The Rolls-Royce began to move. Smooth, silent. The kind of motion you barely feel even on roads covered in ice and snow. My father's hand moved, just slightly. His thumb pressed against the wheelchair armrest, 6 times, deliberate, controlled, counting something I still couldn't understand. I looked at him, at the man who'd spent 15 years in silence writing me letters in the dark building, an empire in secret, orchestrating a test I'd passed, without knowing I was being tested. "Thank you," I said quietly. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in 15 years I saw him smile. The Rolls-Royce had been moving for 20 minutes when I finally spoke again. "Prescott," I said. "Section 4. When exactly?" He turned from the window. "When you're ready." "I'm asking you to define ready," I said. He considered this for a moment. "When the grief from tonight stops being louder than the curiosity," he said. "You'll know." I looked out at the highway. The storm had eased. Road signs caught the headlights in white flashes, Wellesley, Newton, Boston. The charter was still against my chest. I could feel the edge of it through my shirt. I didn't push further, not that night. I studied the signatures at the bottom under the dim reading light Prescott had switched on. Virgil Harrington. D. Caldwell. 2 names. 2 men who'd built something together in 1971 before I was even adopted. Before Celeste. Before any of this. "Who is D. Caldwell?" I asked, looking up at Prescott. "Not when I'm ready now." "Who is he?" Prescott's expression didn't change. He sat in the facing seat with his hands folded in his lap, his Crombie coat still perfectly pressed, despite the night we'd all had. "So that is a question your father explicitly wanted you to discover within the trust assets yourself." He said each word deliberate. "Specifically in Section 4. Some truths must be read in sequence, not explained out of turn. When you are ready," he added. I felt something flare in my chest. Not anger, frustration. "When will I be ready?" I asked. Prescott leaned forward slightly. His eyes met mine with the kind of directness that made me understand why he'd been my father's attorney, for however many decades he'd held that role. "When you've finished grieving what you've lost tonight," he said quietly. "Section 4 will show you what was never lost at all, just hidden in plain sight for 50 years. Hidden in plain sight." I looked at the charter again, at the 2 signatures, At the date, 1971, 53 years ago. Some truths must be read in sequence. That's what Prescott said. Like a book where the last chapter only makes sense if you've read every page that came before it. I was holding the first chapter in my hand. I just didn't know yet that the last chapter would make me forgive my father for every year of silence and make forgiving Celeste impossible. I folded the charter, slipped it back into my breast pocket, right against my chest where I could feel the paper through my shirt. The Rolls-Royce slowed. I looked out the window. We'd pulled alongside another vehicle, one of the black sedans that had taken Celeste and the others away. It was stopped on the shoulder of the road, emergency lights flashing in the falling snow. Prescott reached for the intercom button. 30 seconds, he said to the driver. The window beside me lowered with a smooth electric hum. On the other side of the glass, in the back seat of the transport vehicle, Celeste sat with her hands cuffed in her lap. Her camel coat was gone. Someone had taken it. She wore only the evening dress she'd had on at the party, silk that looked too thin for December diamonds, that caught the emergency lights like broken glass. She tapped on the window. The processing agent beside her nodded, permitted the exchange. She said through the gap between vehicles. Her voice was different, soft. The sharp edge that had cut through 35 years of marriage was gone. What remained was something I'd never heard before, something almost like truth. I grew up with absolutely nothing, she said. 2 dresses for the entire 4 years of high school, cardboard shoved into the soles of my shoes to block the sleet. Poverty is a smell you never get all the way off your skin. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in 35 years, I saw past the performance. Past the designer coats and the borrowed diamonds and the voice that had been trained to sound like old money. I saw the terrified child underneath. The starving girl who'd learned that survival meant taking whatever you could get and never ever letting go. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, understanding. They're not the same thing. I'm sorry, I started to say. Celeste's jaw hardened. The softness vanished from her face like a door slamming shut. It doesn't mean I am sorry, she said, her voice snapping back to ice. The window of her vehicle rolled up. The emergency lights switched off. The sedan pulled back onto the road and accelerated into the storm, taking her away into whatever came next. You can understand where a person's cruelty comes from and still refuse to let it set your table. I saw the girl with cardboard in her shoes. I saw exactly how she became the woman who poisoned my father's tea for 5 years. Understanding the path doesn't mean you have to walk it with them. It doesn't mean you owe them anything at all. My window rolled up. The Rolls-Royce began moving again. Prescott sat quietly across from me, not speaking, giving me space to process what had just happened. I looked at my father. He sat in his wheelchair, hands resting on the armrests, eyes clear and focused, watching me. Always watching. His thumb moved. 7 times. Deliberate. Controlled. Counting something I still didn't understand. Where are we going? I asked Prescott. Your father owns a residence in Boston, he said. Private, secure. Where you can both rest and begin reviewing the trust documents properly. Starting tomorrow if you wish. Or next week. The timeline is yours to determine. He paused. Section 4 will wait, he added quietly. Until you're ready. I nodded, slipped my hand into my breast pocket. Felt the charter there against my chest. The weight of 53 years compressed into a single sheet of yellowed paper. D. Caldwell, a partner no one had mentioned. A name that would rewrite everything. But not tonight. Tonight, I had 217 letters to read. 15 years of my father's witness to absorb. A lifetime of being invisible, finally proven wrong by blue fountain pen ink on cream paper. The car pulled through gates I didn't recognize. Up a driveway lined with trees heavy with snow. toward a house I'd never seen before, but that apparently belonged to the man sitting silently beside me in his wheelchair. The man who'd built an empire in secret, who'd endured poisoning for 5 years to test who would stay, who'd written me a letter every single night for 15 years just to prove I'd been seen. The car stopped. Prescott opened his door. Cold air rushed in, carrying snow and the smell of pine. "Welcome home, Mr. Harrington," he said. And I realized he wasn't talking to my father. He was talking to me. Before we left the estate, I knelt in the snow beside the empty wheelchair, the one that had carried my father through 15 years of silence. And for the first time in all those years, I looked closely at what he had carved into the wood beneath the right armrest where his thumb had rested every single day. The driveway had fallen silent. The last vehicles had pulled away, taillights disappearing into the storm. Only 3 of us remained, me, my father, and Prescott, standing behind me in the falling snow. The wheelchair sat on the porch where security had left it after lifting my father into the Rolls-Royce. Old wood. Worn wheels. The frame darkened by years of use. I ran my fingers along the right armrest, felt the grain, and then I found them. 2 letters, carved deep into the white oak. Veha. Virgil Harrington. The wood was smooth. Completely smooth. Worn down by 15 years of a thumb pressing the exact same spot over and over thousands of times. He had it built the exact year he began his quiet reconstruction, Prescott said from over my shoulder. He always said a man who carves his own name into his own chair never forgets whose chair it is. I traced the letters. VH. His initials. His name. Hidden right under everyone's hands the entire time. Every time he sat in this chair, he touched his own name. A reminder of exactly whose chair it was, whose house, whose empire everyone thought they were inheriting. A man who carves his own name into his own chair. I thought about that for a long time. About what it means to spend 15 years in something you built, touching your own initials every day. Never forgetting that the people who think they own the house are sitting in furniture that belongs to you. That's not patience. That's architecture. There is one more section of the trust documents, Prescott said quietly. The section he instructed me to read last. Your father wanted you to understand the full picture before we got to this part. I stood, looked at the wheelchair one more time, at the carved initials worn smooth by 15 years of deliberate touch. Then I followed Prescott to the Rolls-Royce. We drove through the night. The storm had eased, but the roads were slick with ice. The Massachusetts Turnpike stretched ahead, mostly empty. Dawn was still hours away. My father slept in the seat beside me. Actually slept. Real rest. His breathing, even hands relaxed. Prescott sat in the facing seat, his voice low. 3 years ago, he said, in March at approximately 2 in the morning, our retained attending physician documented that Mr. Harrington moved both legs independently for the first time since the stroke. I looked up sharply. He actually reached out for his bedside lamp. He was going to call out your name, Desmond. The words hit like stones. And then, Prescott said, through the thin wall he heard Celeste and Garrett speaking in the corridor. He pulled out a document, read from it. He memorized their exact words. Quote, the old man is taking too long to fade. Double the compound dosage next week. If he shows any neurological improvement, we move immediately to phase 2. I stopped breathing. Sir Virgil withdrew his hand. Prescott said quietly. He turned off the lamp. He lay back down in the dark. And he wrote letter number 1096 that identical night. He pulled another page from the folder. Cream paper, blue ink. Dear Desmond, Prescott read. Tonight I almost told you everything. I chose instead to remain silent. I will explain when you are entirely safe. I love you more than I have ever known how to say. Prescott folded the letter, set it on the cedar box between us. He could have called for you, he said. He could have ended it that night, 3 years ago. But he heard them planning phase 2, and he chose to stay in the chair, to keep pretending, to let them keep poisoning him. A man who could walk chose to stay in a wheelchair for 3 more years to keep his son safe. I have spent a long time deciding if that was the bravest thing I ever heard or the saddest. I think it was both, and I think Virgil Harrington would have found that distinction irrelevant. How? I asked, my voice hoarse. How did he survive 3 more years of poison? The family doctor, Prescott said. The corrupt one. The one Celeste hired to manage your father's decline. Your father approached him privately, with ironclad proof of the poisoning plot, and a retention fee that made cooperation more profitable than conspiracy. He pulled out another document. During evaluations, the doctor administered harmless sedatives to simulate decline, documented deterioration in the official charts, gave Celeste and Garrett exactly the reports they wanted. Prescott turned the page, and then he returned late at night, through the basement door, administered detox agents, logged your father's real rehabilitation in a secret medical ledger, helped him learn to walk again. I stared at him. Learning to walk again, I repeated. In the dark. My father had spent 3 years recovering in secret, moving his legs when everyone was asleep, standing beside his bed at 2 a.m, walking slow laps around the downstairs rooms while Celeste slept upstairs, and I drove home thinking he was dying. 3 years of choosing the wheelchair when he could have stood. 3 years of choosing silence when he could have spoken. 3 years of letting them poison him while a corrupt doctor turned double agent kept him alive. All to keep me safe from phase 2. Whatever phase 2 was, Prescott put his hand over his mouth. Something that looked almost like reverence. There's more, he said quietly. About the corrupt family doctor, and how your father turned him into a double agent, and what that double agent discovered about when your father actually started to heal. He paused. The part you need to understand is when he started to heal. And why. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten. Gray dawn spreading across the horizon. Boston's skyline appearing in the distance. It wasn't the detox agents, Prescott said. Then what? I asked. He met my eyes. You. The cedar box sat on the desk beside me, lid. Opened the stack of cream envelopes untouched, except for the first one I'd already read. 217 letters. I had time now. The Boston residence was quiet. The storm had passed. Outside, the city moved through its Christmas morning routines, unaware that the family in the penthouse suite had just been dismantled and rebuilt in the space of 3 hours. I opened the second letter, then the third. By the time I reached the 15th, I understood that my father had not been documenting my failures. He had been documenting my character. Every small thing I'd done that I thought went unnoticed, the way I adjusted his blanket before leaving the nights I read aloud from financial journals he supposedly couldn't comprehend, the Tuesday in March, 12 years ago, when I'd driven 40 minutes in a snowstorm simply because I didn't want him to wake up alone. He had written down every single one. I set the letter on the desk, pulled the 1971 charter from my breast pocket, unfolded it carefully under the desk lamp. Virgil Raymond Harrington, D. Caldwell, 2 signatures, 2 men who'd built something together before I was born. I stared at the second name for a long time. Prescott had said Section 4. Some truths must be read in sequence. I reached for the leather folder he'd left on the side table, found the tab marked Section 4, opened it. The first document inside was a dissolution agreement, dated 1985, 40 years old. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the typing was clear, the signatures steady. 3 pages, I read all of them. Then I sat back in the chair and looked out at Boston Harbor where Christmas morning light was beginning to turn the water silver. D. Caldwell was Donald J. Caldwell, Celeste's father. The buyout figure was there in black and white, $2.3 million. Fair market value certified by 2 independent appraisers. A notary stamp. A handwritten letter from Donald to Virgil thanking him for 14 good years and wishing him well. Not a theft. Not a betrayal. A fair deal between 2 men who'd built something together and parted honestly. Somewhere along the years, Celeste had been told a different story. That her father had been cheated. That Virgil had taken everything and left the Caldwells with nothing. That the Harrington fortune was built on her family's loss. It wasn't true. It had never been true. I folded the dissolution agreement and held it in both hands. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere across the harbor. Once, twice, a third time. I thought about 35 years of marriage built on a grievance that never happened. About a woman who'd spent her entire adult life aiming her anger at a man who'd done nothing but pay her father fairly and shake his hand. Understanding the path doesn't mean you walk it with them. I put the document back in the folder, closed section 4, reached for the 16th letter, and kept reading. The elevator doors opened onto a floor of glass and silence, where Prescott's waiting hand gestured toward the boardroom where my inheritance sat mapped across mahogany. I'd triggered the codicil the moment I stepped into the Rolls-Royce on Christmas night. That's what Prescott explained as we rode up. The moment I entered that car with my father, the trust became irrevocable. The test was over. I'd passed without knowing I was being tested. The boardroom was all windows. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Boston's financial district. Gray morning light flooded the space. A conference table stretched the length of the room, polished mahogany reflecting the skyline. Prescott unfolded documents across the table. Charts. Corporate structures. Legal entities nested inside other legal entities like Russian dolls. Harrington Oil and Gas, he said, pointing to the top of the organizational chart. Owned by Harrington Holdings, LLC, which is held under the irrevocable spendthrift trust your father triggered yesterday. He spread more papers across the table. The trust is irrevocable, Desmond, he said, meeting my eyes. You cannot dissolve it, sell it, or walk away from it. I looked at the numbers on the page. $11 billion. Prescott began breaking it down. Offshore oil reserves, $4.2 billion. Commercial real estate holdings, $3.1 billion. Diversified equity portfolio, $2.8 billion. 47 producing wells across Texas and North Dakota, $900 million. He talked for 30 minutes. Legal architecture, corporate structures, governance mechanisms, tax strategies that had been built over 50 years. I listened, absorbed what I could. Let the rest wash over me like rain against glass. When he finished, there was silence. Do you have questions? Prescott asked. I looked at the charts, at the numbers, at the empire my father had built in absolute secrecy while sitting in a wheelchair letting people think he was dying. I need to know one thing, I said. Is the company good to its field workers? Healthcare, safety, wages? Prescott smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him smile all night. Your father asked me to tell you he was waiting for that question, he said. Virgil spoke from his wheelchair at the head of the table. It's better than industry standard, he said, his voice strong. Always has been. I built wealth, not graves. $11 billion, and the only number I cared about was the mortality rate per 1,000 field hours. Prescott excused himself, said he had documents to retrieve from the library. Left me alone in the boardroom with my father and the skyline and the weight of an empire I hadn't asked for but apparently couldn't refuse. I walked to the windows, looked out at the city, at the people moving through their lives 40 stories below, unaware that the man standing above them had just inherited enough money to buy most of the buildings they were walking past. I don't know how to do this, I said quietly. You've been doing it for 15 years, my father replied. You just didn't know what you were practicing for. I turned to look at him. The nightly visits, he continued. The care you gave when there was no reward. The questions you asked about the people who work in the fields. That's leadership, Desmond. Not the spreadsheets. The care. Prescott returned, carrying a small leather folder. He placed it on the table in front of me. Inside was a single sealed envelope. Old paper. Yellowed with age. The date on the front was 15 years ago. To the day. Your father instructed me to give you this when we reached this point in the conversation, Prescott said. I broke the seal. Unfolded the single page inside. My father's handwriting. Blue fountain pen ink. The letter was dated 15 years ago. The exact day I'd worn my brown estate sale suit to the foundation gala for the first time. I read, I watched you walk into the gala in that brown suit with twine holding the cuffs. You didn't notice the stairs. Your brother wore Brioni. Your sister wore Chanel. You wore a suit that cost $40 and looked like a man who was enough. I saw the cuffs. The kitchen twine you'd used because you didn't know how to sew and couldn't afford a tailor. The frayed collar you'd tried to press flat. The shoes you'd polished 3 times to hide the age. You looked like someone who knew he was enough, who didn't need external validation to walk into a room full of people who had everything you didn't. That was the day I decided. Not the will, not the trust. The day I knew who deserved to carry the name forward. The letter trembled in my hands like a leaf that had been waiting 15 years to fall. I looked up at my father. He was watching me with those clear eyes. The eyes that had seen everything. That had never stopped seeing. 15 years, I said. You decided 15 years ago? I decided, he said. But I needed to be certain. Decisions made in a moment can be wrong. Decisions confirmed over 15 years rarely are. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope. Prescott cleared his throat. There's more, he said quietly. He placed 4 more envelopes on the table. Each one sealed, each one labeled with a different date. 1995, 2003, 2011, 2019. Your father didn't just watch you. Desmond Fuani, Prescott said. He documented you. These letters are rooms in a house you thought you knew. I stared at the envelopes. 4 dates. 4 moments. 4 windows into a life I'd lived without knowing I was being measured, catalogued, loved in ways I'd never understood. The first envelope was dated 3 weeks after my mother died. 1995. The year everything changed. The year the family fractured. The year I was 26 years old and had no idea that my father was beginning a test that would last 29 years. Prescott gathered the envelopes, placed them back in the leather folder. Now, these aren't urgent, he said. They're the record of who you really are. Read them when you're ready. There's no test left to pass. He set the folder beside the cedar box. I looked at my father's handwriting on those sealed envelopes, 4 dates spanning 3 decades. 4 windows into moments he'd chosen to document in silence. The folder closed with a soft snap. I left it on the table, reached instead for letter number 16 from the cedar box. Some things I was learning you read in order. The letters would have to wait. Prescott made that clear. There was something else that needed to happen first. The FBI field office smelled like burnt coffee and legal consequence. I signed my name on the authorization form while an agent slid a case file across the metal table. Special Agent Morrison sat across from me. Early 50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of investigator who'd spent decades learning to read people in rooms exactly like this one. She'd been handling white-collar elder abuse cases in Boston since 2018, Prescott had told me. She knew the patterns, knew when families crossed from greed into criminal conspiracy. Your father has been feeding us documentation since October 2020, she said, opening the file. 4 years of emails, financial records, medical logs. He built this case himself. I looked at the dates on the documents she spread across the table. October 2020, 4 years ago, before any of it. My father had been building a prosecution since before COVID. Why wait until now, I asked. Morrison leaned back in her chair. He told us he needed to be certain who would act when the moment came, she said. Turns out he was testing you, not them. She pulled out another document. Garrett's file. Investment advisors act violations for undisclosed conflicts of interest, she read. Failure to report elder abuse under Massachusetts mandatory reporting laws. Conspiracy to commit fraud. She turned the page. Internal emails prove Garrett knew about Celeste's poisoning attempts by August of this year. He concealed evidence. Actively participated in the conspiracy. I read the file. Page after page of evidence. Emails. Bank transfers. Medical records. 4 years of evidence. 15 years of watching. And I still wore the same brown suit with kitchen twine hems. And I still wore the same brown suit with kitchen twine hems. Morrison slid the authorization form toward me. We need your signature, she said. As the primary victim and designated heir, you have to authorize prosecution. It's procedural, but it's required. I picked up the pen. I'm not punishing anyone, I said quietly. I'm just letting truth cost what it always should have. I signed my name. The pen scratched against paper. Final. Irreversible. Morrison took the form, filed it with the others. The arraignments will be scheduled within 72 hours, she said. You don't have to attend. Most family members choose not to. She stood, extended her hand. Your father was one of the most meticulous witnesses I've ever worked with, she said. He documented everything, every dose, every conversation, every financial transaction. It's the most complete elder abuse case I've seen in 20 years. I shook her hand. He had practice, I said. 15 years of documenting silence. Morrison walked me to the holding corridor. Said there was someone who'd asked to see me. 30 seconds. That's all the regulations allowed. Vivian stood behind reinforced glass, handcuffed. The borrowed diamonds were gone. The performance was over. What remained looked smaller, more honest, like someone who'd finally run out of angles to play. The guard opened the communication slot. I didn't hate you, Desmond, she said. Her voice was different, quieter. The sharp edge that had cut through family dinners for years was gone. I just didn't see you. You were always there like wallpaper, background. I looked at her through the glass. When I know, I said. That was the entire problem. Vivian nodded. Once. Sharp. Like she was acknowledging something she'd known for years, but never said out loud. Dad saw you, though, she said. I read the arrest warrant. It mentioned letters. How many did he write about you? Enough, I said. The guard touched my shoulder. Time was up. Vivienne didn't look away. I'm sorry, she said. Not for what she'd done. Just sorry. The way you apologize for weather or traffic. For circumstances that couldn't be changed. The slot closed. I turned away. How do you reconcile being invisible to 3 people and hyper-visible to the one person who mattered most? Morrison walked me back to the interview room. Said there was one more thing my father had asked her to give me. She pulled a flash drive from a locked evidence drawer, labeled with a case number and my name. Your father's complete archive, she said. 217 letters spanning 1995 to 2024. He asked that you read them in order. She placed the drive in my hand. The first letter is dated 3 days after your mother's funeral, she said quietly. He told me that was when he started paying attention, really paying attention, to who his children were when grief stripped away the performance. I closed my fingers around the drive. 217 letters, 29 years. Every moment I thought I was invisible, my father had been watching, writing, documenting everything I did when I believed no one was paying attention. 3 people never saw me. Garrett, Vivian, Celeste. 105-year-old man wrote 217 letters about everything he saw. He said you'd understand when you read them, Morrison continued. Why he waited, why he tested, why silence was the only way to see the truth. She walked me to the exit. For what it's worth, she said at the door. I've been doing this work for a long time. I've seen a lot of families destroy each other over money. But I've never seen a father love a son the way yours loved you. The letters aren't evidence of surveillance, Mr. Harrington. They're evidence of witness. He saw you. Every single day. And he wanted you to know it. The door closed behind me. I stood in the December cold, holding a flash drive that contained 29 years of my father's witness. The first letter was dated 1995, 3 days after my mother died, 3 days after everything changed. That was when Virgil started building the longest test of character in Harrington history, and I'd passed without ever knowing I was being measured. I got into the car. The flash drive felt heavy in my pocket, heavier than something so small should feel. Prescott was waiting in the driver's seat. "Ready?" he asked. I looked out the window at the FBI building, at the place where my family's conspiracy had become official record, where 4 years of my father's evidence had finally been transformed into legal consequence. "Take me home," I said, and realized I wasn't sure where home was anymore. The hotel suite felt too quiet. Outside, Boston's financial district glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, it was just me and a desk lamp and a leather folder labeled Dissolved Partnerships, 1985. Prescott had left it on the desk before retiring for the evening. Section 4, as promised. I found it buried between 2 older corporate filings, 3 pages, Virgil's signature at the bottom, and beside it another name. Donald J. Caldwell, Celeste's father. I sat at the desk with my reading glasses on, staring at numbers that didn't make sense until they suddenly made perfect sense. Donald Caldwell and Virgil Harrington founded the company together in 1971. 50-50 partners. 2 men with a drilling rig and a dream. By 1978, Virgil had bought out enough smaller investors to hold 60%. Caldwell kept 30%. The remaining 10% was scattered among 4 minor stakeholders who'd provided seed capital and faded into comfortable retirement. In 1985, Caldwell wanted out. The buyout agreement was right there. $2.3 million. Fair market value certified by 2 independent appraisers whose credentials were stapled to the back. Caldwell's signature was steady, confident, the handwriting of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The notary stamp was clear. There was even a letter attached, handwritten on personal stationery, addressed to Virgil. "Thank you for 14 good years. I'm ready to retire. Patricia wants to travel while we still can. This is more money than I ever thought I'd see. You built something bigger than both of us. I'm proud to have been part of it. Your friend Dawn." I read it 3 times. Celeste had spent 35 years convinced her father was cheated, that Virgil had stolen the company, that her family's wealth was plundered by a man too ruthless to share. It was all a lie. Not Virgil's lie. Someone else's. Maybe Patricia Caldwell's. Maybe she'd rewritten history after Dawn died, turned a fair business deal into a tragedy to explain why they weren't billionaires. Maybe Celeste's own, maybe she'd needed someone to blame for something else entirely, and Virgil was convenient. Maybe it was just grief that curdled into rage over decades until the truth didn't matter anymore. $2.3 million in 1985 was worth nearly $7 million today. Donald Caldwell had lived comfortably in a restored brownstone in Brookline until he died in 2001. I found his obituary in another file. Beloved husband, devoted father, retired entrepreneur, traveled extensively. No mention of betrayal. No mention of Virgil. Just a man who'd made a fair deal and lived a good life. Let me pause here because this is the part where everything I thought I understood about Celeste collapsed. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't even a daughter defending her father's memory. She was a woman who'd built her entire identity on a grievance that never existed. And she'd weaponized it. 35 years of strategic cruelty aimed at a man who'd done nothing but pay her father fairly and shake his hand. I thought about Virgil sitting in that chair for 15 years. Visitors turned away. Calls unanswered. Letters piling up on a desk he'd never see again. Holidays passing in silence. Birthdays unmarked. Did he even know Celeste blamed him? Did he care? Or had he just accepted it as the cost of building something that outlasted friendship? I called the car service at 8:15 p.m. "I need to go to Wellesley," I said. "And I need you to make sure the estate staff knows I'm bringing Virgil home." The driver hesitated. "Sir, visiting hours at the facility ended at—" "I'm not visiting. I'm bringing him home. Call ahead." It took 40 minutes to get Virgil dressed and into the car. He didn't ask where we were going. He didn't resist. He just sat in the back seat with his hands folded in his lap, staring out the window at the dark highway. The city lights gave way to suburban darkness, trees I couldn't see, houses set back from the road. When we pulled through the gates of the Harrington estate, he leaned forward slightly, just an inch, just enough that I knew he recognized it. "Sure, you're going to sit at the head of the table," I said. "Like you used to." He turned his head toward me. His eyes were rheumy and pale, but there was something in them. Not quite recognition, not quite hope, just attention. The staff had set the dining hall exactly as I'd asked. Every light on, the chandelier blazing, the long mahogany table polished until it gleamed like dark water. 18 chairs arranged in perfect symmetry. At the far end, facing the door, was the chair I remembered from a photograph in Virgil's office. High-backed, leather, worn at the armrests where his hands had gripped it through 1,000 meals, 1,000 decisions, 1,000 quiet moments of power. I walked him down the length of the table. His steps were slow but steady. When we reached the chair, I guided him into it. He sat. His hands found the armrests like they'd never left. His back straightened. His chin lifted. And then he smiled. It wasn't much. Just the corners of his mouth turning up. Just the faintest crease at his eyes. But it was the first smile I'd seen on Virgil Harrington's face in 15 years. "You're home," I said. He nodded. Then his hands clamped down on the armrests. Hard. His knuckles went white. His jaw locked. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. "Virgil," his eyes rolled back. Here's the thing about moments like this: you don't think. You just move. I grabbed his shoulder. "Virgil, stay with me." His whole body went rigid. The smile was gone. His face was gray. I shouted for the staff. Someone ran. I heard footsteps. Voices. My own voice saying his name over and over. Virgil's grip on those armrests didn't loosen, not even when his eyes closed. Prescott caught him before I could move. Thaddeus Prescott, 65 years old. Virgil's estate attorney for 42 years, steadied my father with one hand on his shoulder and said nothing. Just held him upright while I stood frozen with a water glass I'd dropped shards scattered at my feet. Virgil's hands didn't shake as they gripped the armrests. They planted. His weight shifted forward, and then he stood fully upright, knees locked, spine straight for the first time in 15 years. I couldn't breathe. He took one step, then another. His gait was slow but deliberate. Not the shuffle of a man who'd forgotten how to walk. The measured pace of someone who'd been practicing in secret. "Dad." He turned his head toward me. His mouth opened. "The stroke was real, Desmond," he said. His voice. I hadn't heard it since 2009. 15 years. It was rougher now, graveled by disuse, but unmistakably his. 15 years ago, I lost everything. Virgil continued. Speech, movement, control. 3 years ago, you brought me back. Every night. Reading, talking, holding my hand like I mattered. My knees felt weak. I grabbed the edge of the table. You could speak, I said. You could walk. 3 years ago, he confirmed. October 2021. I did the math in my head. 2021. 3 years of silence. 3 years of sitting in that chair while I read to him. While I adjusted his blankets. While I talked about Vivian's postcards and Garrett's empty promises and the slow collapse of everything I thought I knew about family. He'd heard all of it and said nothing. Why, my voice cracked. Virgil lowered himself into a dining chair. Not the wheelchair, not the head of the table, just a standard chair halfway down the length of polished mahogany. Prescott stood behind him, silent hands folded. October 2021, Virgil said. I heard them through the wall, your brother and Celeste, planning to remove you if I died first. You were the obstacle, the one who'd contest the will, the one who'd ask questions. I felt the room tilt. They said remove, I asked. Virgil nodded. Celeste used the word arrange. Garrett said, as long as it looks natural. I was in the west sitting room. They were in the hall. Stone walls carry sound better than people think. I sat down hard in the nearest chair. I stayed silent to keep you safe, Virgil said. A man who can speak is a man who can change a will. A man who can walk is a man who might recover fully. As long as I appeared too fragile to matter, the threat stayed focused on me. Not you. You stayed in that chair for 3 years, I said slowly. Let me feed you, bathe you, read to you. All while I could answer, Virgil finished. But wouldn't. Because the day I spoke, Desmond, was the day you became the target. Shh. 3 years. I said it out loud, but I wasn't talking to him. I was talking to the space between us. 15 years of silence. 12 years of real paralysis. 3 years of chosen muteness. Virgil could speak for 3 years. Chose silence. Chose the wheelchair. Chose to let me read to him a man who could answer but wouldn't. Prescott poured 2 glasses of water from a carafe on the sideboard. He set one in front of Virgil, one in front of me, and returned to his position behind my father without a word. This wasn't new information to him. He'd known. Maybe the whole time. I could have sued in the 90s when I first found irregularities, Virgil said. Offshore accounts that didn't match ledgers. Real estate purchases under shell names. I chose to build instead. Not for revenge, for clarity. The clarity, I repeated. I needed to know who you were when no one was watching, Virgil said. Not at galas, not in board meetings, not when cameras were rolling or shareholders were listening. In the dark, Desmond, reading to a dying man who couldn't answer. That's where character lives. I stared at him. You tested me, I said. I observed you, Virgil corrected. There's a difference. A test has a right answer. Observation just watches what you choose when there's no reward. For 15 years. 12 years I had no choice, Virgil said. 3 years I had every choice. I chose to stay silent because the moment I spoke, you'd stop coming. You'd stop reading. You'd think the job was done. But I needed to see who you were when the job would never be done. When I'd never thank you. Never acknowledge you. Never even blink. His hands were steady on the table. No tremor, no weakness. You showed up anyway, he said quietly. Every night. Sometimes twice a day. You talked to me like I could hear you, held my hand like it mattered, argued with Garrett in the hallway, and then came back and read poetry like nothing had happened. Because you're my father, I said. Because you're my son, Virgil replied. The one I needed, not the one I raised. I felt something break open in my chest. And Garrett was the heir, Virgil continued. Vivienne was the charm. You were the one I didn't plan for. The mistake baby at 40. The one who stayed when staying meant nothing. He leaned forward. Now I built an $11 billion empire by knowing when to drill and when to wait, he said. I knew how to find oil. I never knew how to find character. So I waited. I watched. I let 15 years show me what a lifetime of fatherhood never did. How do you reconcile being tested for 15 years by a man who loved you enough to stay silent for 3 just to keep you breathing? I asked it out loud, but Virgil didn't answer. He just looked at me with those pale eyes that saw everything now. You tested me for 15 years, I said. Stayed silent for 3, all to see if I'd show up when it didn't matter. It always mattered, Virgil said. You just didn't know I was keeping score. He stood again, slower this time, but steady. He walked to the mahogany sideboard against the far wall and opened the bottom drawer. When he turned back, he held a sealed envelope, different from the others. Cream-colored paper. No name on the front. Just a date written in Virgil's own hand, December 26th, 2024. Today. This one isn't about the past, Desmond, Virgil said, setting it on the table between us. It's about tomorrow. What you do when the test is over and the work actually begins. I didn't open the envelope that night. I folded it into my jacket and helped Virgil to the second-floor guest suite. By 1 in the morning, we sat in the old library, me in the leather wingback, Virgil in the wheelchair he no longer needed, but hadn't abandoned. His hand moved to the left armrest. Not resting, searching. He pressed something beneath the worn leather, a hidden catch, and a miniature drawer slid open. No bigger than a matchbox. Inside was a photograph, faded, creased at one corner. A boy in an oversized dress shirt, smiling too wide. The boy was me, 8 years old. The shirt hung past my wrists. I took the photograph with trembling fingers and turned it over. Virgil's handwriting. Blue ink slightly smudged. The day I became the luckiest man alive. December 19th, 1972. Adoption Day. I put this in the armrest the week after the stroke, Virgil said quietly. When I couldn't speak or move. A nurse helped me hide it. I stared at my 8-year-old face. At the shirt 3 sizes too big. You said I'd grow into it, I whispered. You did, Virgil said. Took 2 years. You wore it until the cuffs frayed. He touched the photograph's edge with one finger. Taught it every dark night when I could walk again, but chose the chair I touched this corner, he said. To remember the boy I fought to keep safe. December 19th, 1972. I said. I remember that shirt. 3 sizes too big. Virgil nodded. I bought it on purpose. Wanted you to have something to grow into. Something that said you had time. I set the photograph on the table between us. An 8-year-old boy hidden in a wheelchair all along. 15 years of paralysis. 3 years of chosen silence. 52 years of fatherhood, all compressed into a photograph the size of a playing card, hidden where only broken hands could find it. Prescott's office at 10 in the morning smelled like old law books and leather. Virgil sat in a standard chair, now upright and steady. The attorney had 4 colored folders arranged before him. The quitclaim deed is void ab initio, invalid from inception, Prescott said, tapping the red folder. Chapter 183. The house was never theirs. The trust was never theirs. You were always the heir, Desmond. Suffolk County DA is pursuing elder abuse felonies. He continued moving to the blue folder. SEC has opened enforcement proceedings for investment fraud. Massachusetts Bar Association is investigating Garrett's license. How long will the prosecutions take? I asked. Prescott glanced at his notes. Celeste's trial begins March 2025. Garrett's in June. Vivian will plead out within 60 days. You won't need to attend any of it if you choose not to. I thought about sitting in a courtroom, watching Garrett in a defendant's chair. Celeste's face cracking under cross-examination. "And I won't attend," I said. Prescott slid a green folder toward me. Trust authority transfers immediately upon signature. 4 documents. Once you sign, everything passes to your sole discretion. I picked up the pen. 4 signatures, 4 documents, each one severing ties to people who never saw me. When I finished, Prescott stood. The estate is yours, Desmond. What you do with it is entirely your choice. I looked at Virgil. He watched me with those pale, steady eyes. I'll decide when I'm ready, I said. At 3 in the afternoon, I pushed Virgil through the estate's front doors for the last time. The Rolls-Royce waited at the circular drive, Prescott standing beside it. The wheelchair rolled smoothly over stone steps. 15 years of pushing a man who couldn't walk. 3 years of pushing a man who could but chose not to. Prescott opened the car door, then glanced at the wheelchair. Should I arrange storage for the chair? He asked. You won't need it anymore. It comes with us, I said. Every piece of it. Prescott nodded and helped Virgil into the back seat. I folded the wheelchair carefully, frame, collapsing wheels, locking. I carried it to the trunk and set it inside like something sacred, because it was. The photograph was still in the hidden drawer tucked in the left armrest. I touched the corner once before closing the trunk. You're keeping the wheelchair? Virgil asked from the back seat. I climbed in beside him. Yes. Why? Because it carried you when you couldn't walk, and it carried you when you could. It's part of the story. Virgil turned his head toward the window without answering. The wheelchair folds into the Rolls-Royce's trunk, like a flag from a war no one else knew was fought. My hand resting on the armrest, where an 8-year-old boy's face has been waiting all along. The car pulled away slowly. I watched through the rear window as the house grew smaller. Every light was on. I'd told the staff to turn them all on before we left. Every chandelier, every lamp, every fixture. The house blazed against the late afternoon sky. 3 people had tried to steal it. 3 people had lived in it like it was theirs. 3 people had planned and schemed and betrayed for the right to claim this address. Now it sat empty. I wasn't going to live there. I wasn't going to sell it. I wasn't going to let anyone else claim it. I was going to let it stand exactly as it was, every window burning with light, every room vacant, every corner echoing with silence. A monument to misplaced greed, the house belonging to the wrong people finally left to silence. Virgil's hand found mine in the space between us. You're letting it go, he said quietly. I watched the estate shrink behind us, chandeliers burning for rooms no one would occupy. No, I said. I'm letting them go. 4 days after we left the estate burning with light, I stood at the base of the Suffolk County Courthouse steps, while 3 people in handcuffs were escorted past me into a building I chose not to enter. December 29th, 2024. Morning fog still clung to the granite columns. Federal marshals flanked each prisoner, Celeste first, then Garrett, then Vivian trailing behind with her head down. A marshal read the charges aloud at the top of the steps, voice carrying down to where I stood on the sidewalk. Celeste Marie Harrington, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, 3 counts, attempted murder, wire fraud, under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343, violations of the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. The list went on. Federal charges, state charges, SEC violations, each count a separate breach of law, each one documented in the 217 letters Virgil had spent 15 years writing. Celeste paused when she saw me, just for a moment. Her attorney's hand was on her elbow, guiding her forward, but she stopped. We didn't speak. She looked at me like she was waiting for something. An accusation, a statement, some final confrontation that would let her cast herself as the victim one more time. I said nothing. She climbed the steps. Garrett passed next, flanked by 2 marshals and his own attorney, a man in an expensive suit, who kept whispering instructions. Garrett glanced down at me, then turned to his lawyer. He's not even going inside, Garrett said loud enough for me to hear. His attorney didn't answer. Vivian came last, smallest of the 3, quietest. She stopped at the bottom step just a few feet from where I stood. You won, she said quietly. I looked at her, 28 years old, my daughter. The one who'd sent postcards from Barcelona and Buenos Aires and Bangkok while Virgil sat in silence. Nicole, I said, I just stopped losing. She nodded once, then climbed the steps. The courthouse doors closed behind them. I stayed outside, not because I couldn't go in, not because I wasn't allowed. I'd been invited to observe. Prescott had offered to save me a seat in the gallery. I stayed outside because justice for me was never about watching them suffer. It was about ensuring truth had consequences. The doors closed. The consequences began. That was enough. 3 people in handcuffs climbing courthouse steps, while the man they tried to erase stands at the bottom, choosing not to follow, because some victories don't require you to watch your enemies fall. The executive boardroom at Harrington Oil and Gas headquarters smelled like polished wood and old coffee. I entered on the first Monday of January the 6th, wearing a new suit, tailored in the same traditional cut as my old brown one. Different fabric, same lines. 16 executives sat around the mahogany table. I recognized some faces from galas and quarterly meetings. Others I'd never met. The head chair stood empty at the far end. High-backed leather, the kind of chair that made a statement just by existing. I walked past it. I sat at the opposite end of the table in a standard chair identical to the 15 others. A woman in her late 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes glanced at the empty head chair, then at me. Margaret Bellamy, the company's chief operating officer. She'd been with Harrington Oil since 1989, 36 years of watching this company grow from regional player to industry force. Before we discuss quarterly projections, I said I need baseline data. Safety logs, compensation structures, turnover rates for field workers in Oklahoma and North Dakota. The room went quiet. Margaret smiled. Not polite, not performative, genuine. Your father asked that exact question his first time in this room, she said. 1971. Before revenue, before expansion, before anything else. I felt something tighten in my chest. He wanted to know if the men doing the hardest work were being taken care of. Margaret continued. Not shareholders, not executives, field workers. The ones who couldn't call a board meeting if something went wrong. She pulled a tablet toward her and tapped through several screens. Current field worker compensation is indexed to cost of living plus 3%, she said. Safety training is mandatory quarterly. Turnover rate is 4%, industry average is 18. We've had 0 fatalities in 11 years. I nodded slowly. Good. That continues. Always has, Margaret said. Your father built that into the charter in 1974. Can't be changed without unanimous board vote. I looked around the table. 16 faces watching me, waiting to see what kind of leader I'd be, whether I'd demand the head chair, whether I'd prioritize profit over people. whether I'd be Virgil's son in name only or in practice. Some chairs take time to earn, I said quietly. I've been earning this one for 15 years. Margaret nodded. Several executives exchanged glances. A new suit tailored in an old. Cut a question repeated across 54 years. A man who pushed a wheelchair for 15 years, now sitting at the table he never demanded, but always deserved. One more thing, Margaret said. She slid a folder across the table toward me. Not financial reports, not projections, something else. What's this? I asked. Field worker testimonials, she said. We've been collecting them since the 70s. Company tradition. Workers write about management safety culture, anything they want documented. These are the ones that mention you specifically. I opened the folder, 17 letters. Handwritten. Some on company letterhead. Some on notebook paper. The first one was dated December 1998. I read the opening lines. Chaktichant. Want to put in writing my thanks to Mr. Harrington's son, who visits the Oklahoma rigs every Christmas. He checks the safety equipment himself and remembers everyone's kids' names. My daughter graduated high school this year. He asked about it in December. Didn't have to. Just did. That's the kind of leadership that makes a difference. I looked up at Margaret. My 26 years, she said. Every Christmas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, sometimes Texas. You probably don't remember most of it, but they do. I stared at the letter. December 1998. I'd been 34 years old. Virgil was still running the company. I wasn't on the board, wasn't an executive, just the quiet son who showed up to field sites during holidays when everyone else stayed home. I thought those visits were invisible. Turns out they were the opposite. I read all 17 letters that night. 26 years of field workers documenting moments I'd forgotten, safety checks, remembered names, questions about their families. The next afternoon, I went to see Virgil. January light filled the penthouse, cold and clear. Virgil stood from his chair, still unhurried, still deliberate, and moved toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor with the measured pace I was only beginning to recognize as his natural gait after 15 years of watching him sit. Ice was forming along the edges where the water met the shore. He didn't need help, didn't ask for it, just walked. I brought tea from the kitchen, 2 cups English breakfast, the kind he used to drink every morning before the stroke. I set them on the small table between 2 chairs facing the windows. We sat. For the first time in 15 years, we just sat together without performance, without measurement, without walls that carried sound to people who wanted him dead. Virgil held his teacup with both hands, steady, no tremor. I could stand again 3 years ago, he said quietly. But what I missed most wasn't walking. It was this sitting with you without performance. I looked at him, 81 years old now, January 2025. Still sharp, still deliberate. We have time now, I said. No walls, no audience, just us. Virgil nodded slowly. He turned his head toward the window, watching the harbor ice thicken in the cold. Geez, I watched you through that window reflection for 15 years, he said. Watched you arrive every night thinking I couldn't see. I saw everything. I followed his gaze. The window glass reflected the room behind us chairs. Table the doorway I'd walked through thousands of times. You saw me coming, I said. Every time, Virgil confirmed. Even when I couldn't move. Even when I couldn't speak. The glass showed me your headlights in the driveway, your shadow at the door, you arriving when no one asked you to. He took a sip of tea. What I missed most during the years of strategic silence wasn't speech or mobility, he said. It was this. Just sitting next to you without having to perform for an audience, without measuring every breath for who might be listening through walls. I felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not vindication, just peace. 15 years, I said. 15 years of testing, Virgil said. 3 years of silence. 53 years of being your father. All so we could finally sit here drinking tea without either of us performing. 15 years of silence. 3 years of chosen muteness. 53 years of fatherhood. All so we could finally sit by a window drinking tea without either of us performing for invisible audiences. Late January turned into early March. Snow melted. Ice retreated from the harbor. I went to a bespoke tailor on Newbury Street, a place I'd walked past 100 times but never entered. Samuel Hewitt ran the shop. Master tailor, 62 years old, with measuring tape draped around his neck like a stethoscope. He'd been crafting traditional American business suits for Boston's financial elite since 1987. "Mr. Harrington," he said when I walked in. "I heard you'd taken the chair. Congratulations." I nodded. "I need new suits. The one I'm wearing is 10 years old." Hewitt studied my brown suit, the estate sale find, with kitchen twine hems that had finally started unraveling at the cuffs. He touched the fabric, examined the stitching, noted the traditional cut. "It's a classic American business style," he said. "Very traditional. With your resources, Mr. Harrington, we could do Italian silk, modern European cut, any designer you prefer. Armani, Brioni, whatever you like." I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The brown suit hung well despite its age. The cut was conservative, dignified. The kind of suit a man wore when he wanted to be taken seriously without making a spectacle. "The same cut I'm wearing," I said. "Traditional American business style. My father wore suits like this. I'm keeping the tradition." Hewitt paused, then smiled. "Not because you can't afford better, because this is what better looks like to me," I said. Hewitt nodded slowly. He pulled out his measuring tape and began taking measurements: shoulders, chest, waist, inseam. He worked quickly, professionally, noting numbers in a leather-bound book. "How many suits?" he asked. 6, I said. "Rotating wardrobe, same cut. Vary the colors: charcoal, navy, brown, black. Professional. Not flashy." "Traditional wool?" Hewitt asked. "Yes. American mills, if possible." Hewitt made another note. "We can source from a heritage mill in Massachusetts. Been weaving since 1842. Beautiful fabric, traditional weight. Perfect." He stepped back, studying me in the mirror. "Tradition doesn't have a price tag, sir," he said quietly. "Some things were never for sale." I met his eyes in the reflection. Exactly. A 10-year-old brown suit with unraveling kitchen twine hems becomes the template for a new wardrobe worth thousands, because tradition isn't what you can't afford. It's what you refuse to sell. Outside March, snow had turned to sleet, tapping against Newbury Street's windows like impatient fingers. Hewitt walked me to the door, confirming the first fitting would be ready in 2 weeks. My phone rang as I stepped onto the sidewalk. "Thaddeus Prescott," I answered. "Thaddeus. Desmond, we have a situation." His voice was tight, professional, the tone he used when something had gone wrong. "Garrett's attorney filed a motion this morning." I stopped walking. Sleet melted against my coat. "What kind of motion?" "Claiming Virgil coerced the 2021 medical recovery testimony," Prescott said. "They're requesting psychiatric evaluation and attempting to void the entire trust structure. Argument is that if Virgil was mentally incompetent, when he regained faculties, every decision since then is invalid." I watched sleet turn the sidewalk dark. "They're saying he was incompetent. They're saying the 15-year test was the delusion of a sick man," Prescott said. "Not strategy, not protection, delusion. If they win, the trust is void. Estate reverts to intestate succession among all heirs. I stood on Newbury Street while sleet turned to rain. "When's the hearing?" I asked. "April," Prescott said. "We'll fight it. But you need to know this is their last play. And if they win, everything changes." Garrett's legal challenge to the trust structure was dismissed in February, 2 months before his criminal arraignment was scheduled to begin. The judge ruled in 4 pages what I'd known for 15 years. Virgil Harrington's mind was never the problem. His strategy was just patient enough that impatient people mistook it for weakness. The wheelchair sits by the boardroom window now like a relic in a museum. The trust was upheld. The empire stayed intact. And this wooden frame with its worn armrests occupies permanent space where decisions worth billions get made. January 2025. The board met for the first time with the wheelchair positioned against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Rebecca Townsend, a newly appointed board member and strategic operations expert, studied it for several minutes before raising her hand. "Mr. Chairman," she said carefully, "is that wheelchair by the window intentional? Seems like unusual decor for a modern boardroom." The room went quiet. I looked at the wheelchair. At the left armrest, where a hidden drawer still held a photograph of an 8-year-old boy in an oversized shirt. "And that is the founder's chair," I said. "He spent 15 years sitting inside it so that I could have the strength to stand. It stays exactly where it is." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Understood, sir." No one questioned it again. The wheelchair became part of the room. Not hidden in storage, not relegated to some corporate museum basement. Right there where every quarterly projection and every safety report and every compensation decision got made in its presence. A monument to 15 years of invisible devotion. April 17th, 2025. 5:12 in the morning. Virgil Harrington passed peacefully in his sleep at Massachusetts General Hospital. 105 years old. He'd outlived most of his generation, outlived the stroke by 16 years, outlived the conspiracy by 5 months. I signed the paperwork in a windowless administrative office that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The hospital chaplain asked if I needed time alone with the body. I said no. I'd already had my time, 15 years of it. 3 of those years sitting beside a man who could hear me but chose not to answer. I walked to my car in the underground parking garage as dawn broke somewhere above the concrete ceiling. The cedar box sat in the passenger seat. 218 letters. I'd read them all except one. Letter 218. I opened it. Virgil's handwriting. Dated December 26th, 2024. The morning after he stood for the first time in 15 years and walked across the room to hand it to me himself. The letter said, "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and that's fine. I got 15 extra years I didn't deserve and 3 years of real conversation at the end. More than most men get. This is how I know your soul in the quiet, in the deep dark, when nobody is watching. That is when you are most completely yourself. Not at galas, not in boardrooms, not when cameras are rolling, in the dark reading to a man who couldn't answer, holding a hand that couldn't squeeze back, showing up when showing up carried no reward. That is exactly the man I built this empire for. Not the performance, the silence, the showing up, the care that carried no witness. You think I tested you for 15 years? I didn't. I just gave you space to become who you already were. Love, Dad. 105 years of life, 53 years of fatherhood, 15 years in a wheelchair, 3 years of chosen silence, all compressed into a cedar box containing 218 letters that nobody knew existed until the test was over. December 25th, 2025. Exactly 1 year after the night everything changed. I flew to Oklahoma, not for a board meeting, not for an inspection, For lunch, the drilling site cafeteria smelled like slow-braised pork shoulder at 11 in the morning. 5 hours of cooking. Low heat. The same recipe Virgil had taught me that first winter when I was 32 and he was still running the company. 600 field workers lined up for Christmas lunch. I stood by the cafeteria doors. In one of the new suits, Samuel Hewitt had tailored traditional cut charcoal wool, the same dignified style I'd worn for a decade, in brown. The 1972 adoption photograph was still in my breast pocket. I'd transferred it from the wheelchair's hidden drawer to my suit the day after Virgil died. Carried it everywhere now. A reminder. A field supervisor approached, plate in hand, steam rising from the pork. Mr. Harrington. He said, "This recipe, it's the same one your father used to make when he visited sites back in the 70s. You brought it back." 5 hours, I said. Low and slow. Some things shouldn't be rushed. My father taught me that about more than just cooking. The supervisor smiled and moved toward a table. I heard a worker at the next table say to his crew, "Man who runs a company worth billions still shows up on Christmas to make sure we eat well. That's Harrington legacy right there." I didn't correct him. Didn't explain that the legacy wasn't the showing up. It was the 5 hours of cooking when no one was timing me. The recipe followed exactly, even though shortcuts existed. The care measured in patience, not performance. 600 workers eating slow-braised pork on Christmas Day. Tasting care measured in hours, not dollars. Learning that legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you cook for 5 hours when no one's keeping score. I touched the photograph through my suit pocket. December 19th, 1972. An 8-year-old boy in an oversized shirt standing beside a man who would spend 53 years proving that love is patient work, measured in decades, not moments. Virgil had lost one company, built a bigger one in silence, endured 15 years in a wheelchair, and 3 more years mute. But dignity when no one was watching was the only thing that made him truly rich. Not the empire, not the assets, not the quarterly earnings or the board seats or the estate in Wellesley. The dignity, the showing up, the 5-hour recipes on Christmas morning. The wheelchair positioned where billion-dollar decisions got made so no one would forget what those decisions cost. Silence was the loudest thing I ever heard because it taught me that worth isn't performed. It's lived in the dark when nobody's watching. And now, standing in an Oklahoma cafeteria, while 600 people ate food I'd spent 5 hours preparing, I finally understood. I didn't inherit an empire. I inherited the patience to build one the right way. And to you listening to my story, remember this: worth isn't measured by applause. For 15 years, I thought I was the forgotten son. The one who showed up to read poetry to a paralyzed father while my family fought over his empire. The one who showed up to read poetry to a paralyzed father while my siblings fought over his empire. I didn't realize that those quiet nights when nobody was watching, when there was no reward, were exactly what made me qualified to lead. Don't make my mistake of thinking the invisible work doesn't count. It's the only work that does. The lesson my father taught me is, this legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you do when no one's keeping score. The wheelchair in my boardroom reminds me that dignity when nobody's watching is the only wealth that compounds. I believe God put me through those 15 years reading to a silent father because some lessons can't be taught, they have to be lived. Like the best grandpa stories, this one taught me that showing up without applause is how you build something real. These grandpa stories are blueprints for living with integrity. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you experienced quiet devotion from someone in your life? Or maybe you've been the one showing up when nobody noticed. Leave a comment and share your perspective. I read everyone. If you know someone who needs this message, please share it with them. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to Dad's Revenge Stories. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'm grateful you chose to spend this time with me. Final reminder, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and reflection, but the lesson at its heart is what I hope you carry forward.